one of the things is that as we're focusing in teams and the leadership mindset is like we also have to do experimentation because we're talking about innovation, right? Run the experiment, evaluate the hypothesis. And so Lena is going to take that on and talk about and share something more about, the type of experimentation that she has been involved with, some of the successes and failures. So go for it, Lena.
Thank you. I'm kind of starting where Brandon started also, like, because I think I want to comment on a lot of things that's already been in this space. I'm loving how it's, even though we didn't prep together, it's almost like this panel is just like, we're just building and building and building on each other, right? Like the collaboration, the power of being in those relationships, modeling certain behaviors, inviting in for those connection pieces. That's like a red thread through all of this that we're talking about, which is really a kudo back to the whole framework, Dave, right? That you've created, that how these things are linked as we're talking about them. So I'll be happy to talk about the experimentation piece. Like, why is it important that we run these kind of experiments? What can be powerful, and actually the example I want to pull in is actually also how I saw it was essentially necessary for this organization to really feel that they were in it together. So that's where I think experimentations also can be really powerful, and then that's looping back to the whole, like, we win and lose as a team, and that becomes like a sense of team building in itself, right? So again, all these are connected. But when you asked me to come up with an example, what really stood out to me was some client work I did last, like in the spring, that was around supporting more fluid and productive hybrid work. So this was an organization that had before the pandemic had very much was very defined. Its culture was very defined around the physical space that we go to work and do our work in. So when the pandemic hit, they of course had to do remote work, and they did that. But as many organizations, they were able to be fairly productive doing that, but the collaboration and the interlinked was just disappearing. Like, there was a lot of, I'm doing this, I'm heads down, I'm going to get my tasks done, but the sense of the team, the sense of us as an organization. So then after the pandemic, the organization's like, we're going to now do hybrid, because people want that flexibility that they had during the pandemic and working remotely, but we also want to get that sense of ourselves being together in the team. Let's be better at doing hybrid. And they were not very good at it. And then I got pulled in. They're like, how can we tell us what to do? And I was like, well, we got to figure out what's going on in this organization, and there was a mandate. Now we're going hybrid, right? So the whole organization has already was pushing back. So it's like, I'm not going to be the one to go in and put other mandates on about how you're going to do this work. Like, that's the last thing. So I will do the work with you if we're going to go in and do some experimentations. Let's plant some seeds. Let's figure out what these teams need and what they're ready and curious to actually explore around hybrid work. Where are their needs in terms of getting better at doing this hybrid work? What are they not willing or curious to do because they got burned through the pandemic? Do they even have a good sense of what hybrid is? A lot of them was like, we're actually equalizing hybrid with remote. It was like, no, hybrid is that when we actually have opportunities to be in person. But what's our in-person ratio? What's our rhythm of being in person, and when do we do things remotely? So what we did was started a hybrid lab where each team were exploring different things that they want to experiment with. And some of the things that came up was experimenting on what's our frequency of that in-person rhythm. As a team, how often are we going to be? Is that every Thursday? Is it 3 days a week we're in person? Like, what works with us, but on team basis, not the whole organization. So they're experimenting with that. They were also experimenting with their meeting facilitation, because one of the hardest thing about hybrid is actually the hybrid meeting. It's a messy forum. So they were rotating facilitations, different people coming in and testing that forum so they could learn from each other, figuring out what works for us, different temperaments, different facilitation styles was working in that. And another thing, they were experimenting with a lot of things, but another thing I want to point out, they're experimenting with asynchronous tools, because how can we really piggyback on the hybrid when sometimes we're synchronized together, but what's the power of us actually collaborating, getting a sense of each other when we're asynchronized together? So the experimentation portion was that each team got to take apart the pieces of hybrid that was most relevant for them, mess around with them in a safe container, and then evaluate. Back to Brandon's, he was talking about retros, right? Going back and looking at what worked here, what are we not going to do ever again, what pieces do we want to rebuild on, and then as an organization, they started building a catalog of like, yes, what is hybrid for us? What works for us? So that's where the experimentation was very powerful.
Thank you so much for sharing that, because I know it's a thing, right? That people are fighting with the hybrid model after working remote after COVID itself.